Hi, everybody. Welcome to our public conversation with Dr. Najiba Syeed. It's wonderful to have you with us today.
Well, thank you. I'm excited to be here.
I'm going to read a little bit about you for our gathered folks here. Najiba Syeed is a peacemaker, a healer, and a scholar. Najiba is the inaugural El-Hibri Endowed Chair and Executive Director of Interfaith at Augsburg University. She has been a professor, expert practitioner, and public speaker for the last 2 decades in the fields of conflict resolution, interfaith studies, mediation, education, deliberative democracy, and social, gender, and racial equity. She's been a public servant with the Los Angeles City Council, an associate professor of Muslim and interreligious studies at Chicago Theological Seminary, and an associate professor of interreligious education at Claremont School of Theology. She has chaired national conferences on Muslim and interfaith peacebuilding, served as a mediator in many cases, and initiated restorative justice mediation programs in many institutions, including the University of Southern California. The book she co-edited, Critical Approaches to Interreligious Education, features leading Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars reflecting on interfaith peacemaking between and amongst communities. Along with colleagues, she has developed training modules in Islamic conflict resolution and mediation presented at Harvard Law School. She served as the co-chair of the American Academy of Religion's Religion and Politics section, and was a member of the Academy's Religion, Social Conflict, and Peace section. She has been featured in the Los Angeles Times, on NPR, PBS, on the Tavis Smiley Show, worked with Oprah Winfrey on 2 projects, and has been quoted by print and news media around the globe. We are so honored to welcome Dr. Najiba Syeed to Yale Divinity School this evening.
It was wonderful.
Welcome.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to hire you for all my introductions. If you let me know your fee. Wonderful.
Oh, we're very honored to have you today. And I'm Vicki Flippin. I'm the Associate Dean for Student Affairs here at YDS. And to start off our introductions, sure. I have a practice of inviting people to tell the community a fun fact about yourself. I think this engenders curiosity about these amazing souls that we have around us. And so I'll tell you a fun fact about myself, sure. And then you can tell me a fun fact. My fun fact today is that as a middle schooler, I was obsessed with the guy who played Ian Malcolm on Jurassic Park, who is, anybody know? Jeff Goldblum. Thank you. Dr. Syeed, would you give us a fun fact?
So a fun fact about me is when I was in college, I was really active on the spoken word poetry circuit. I guess there's a circuit, in case you're wondering. And then I took something like a 20-year, well, longer now, almost 30-year break from performing and writing. And then I had a friend who initiated a practice in Ramadan, the month of fasting, where we had to write a poem every day in Ramadan. And so I kind of picked up the poetic pen after decades of being away and just signed for my second book. It's going to be a book of poetry about the pandemic. It's called Dreaming Lost Bodies Back, based on research and doing theology in times of crisis. But I was telling students today the only way I could think about that work was through poetry. So the fun fact is I'm returning to something that I did when I was in college. I hope it's still cool, but that's the fun fact of the day.
I love it. Yeah. I can't wait to read. I definitely am going to read this poetry about.
I need to finish writing it, so
okay.
I hope you can read it.
All right. Okay.
But I'm very excited. It says something about, I think sometimes the form of our thought kind of can lead us into a direction that we didn't anticipate. So, yeah. So whatever you were doing 20, 30 years ago may come back in your life. It's one of the lessons.
I love it.
Yeah.
Well, I am definitely, my curiosity is piqued. I would love to hear, actually, you tell a story or two about why you do this work. We all have stories that motivate us into our callings.
Absolutely.
And so please tell us some stories.
So I think one of the stories, a lot of people think about this word restorative justice, and one of the kind of the ways that I went down this path when I left Kashmir when I was 3, and because of the conflict in that region, it was not safe for my family to travel back. And so my father waited till he was a US citizen for us to be able to go back. And so that meant I didn't get to go back till I was 15, and I was a naturalized citizen at the time. I left when I was 3. And it was really, there's this story of kind of, I didn't grow up with extended family. I didn't grow up with my grandparents my grandfathers both passed away, and then I didn't grow up with extended family. So at the age of 15, it was after my freshman year of high school, and this was the time before the internet, before FaceTime, and all these other wonderful tools where we can connect with people. And so we would get like a picture in the mail, or those, I don't know if anyone remembers these blue airmail, or letters, and a phone call would be hello, and it was $4, and you'd say hello, and then you would kind of yell back and forth and hang up the phone. So I grew up with no cousins, aunts, uncles, or anything. It was just the immediate family. So I got off the airplane, and our family at that time, I think people were able to come almost close to the tarmac. I got off the airplane. It was the first time at 15 that I saw people who looked like me and looked like my parents. I mean, I just started crying because I saw these men and women and other folks that, aunts and uncles that looked like my parents, and I just had not had that experience. And I met my grandmother. 2 grandmothers were still alive for the first time because I had kind of grown up without them. And it was really just striking to me. So as I'm getting off the airplane, I'm having this moment of incredible joy and connection. We left because of the conflict, and then I looked around, we got in the cars, and people were fighting over us. That was such an incredible feeling. Like, people were like, no, come to my house. We also call that Kashmiri hospitality. It's very assertive. It's like, and if you don't come to my house, I'll never talk to you again. It's very dramatic. So they're fighting over us, and it was just not an I just didn't even know what to do with those emotions. So all these things are happening, and it's a lot of joy. Then we get into the cars, and we're going to whoever won the fight of which house we go to. So we went to, I think it was my uncle's house, and we're driving to my uncle's house, but at that moment in history, every 50 feet, there was a soldier with an automatic rifle on their back because of the situation at that time. And it just really hit me, like there's this moment of profound joy and then a moment of profound understanding at the age of 15 that this is where my parents had grown up, and I had been here till I was 3. So it was this feeling of, okay, we left this kind of this family, but then also what my family has been living through in that reality. And so as most 15-year-olds would do, I don't know if most 15-year-olds would do that, and I just realized my daughter's 15. But I kind of made this promise to God as I saw this presence of reality and what people are living with in terms of that moment of history. I said, I just want to make sure that my spirituality and my existence are dedicated to peace. So it's kind of like, I teach at a Lutheran institution. Lutherans are obsessed with vocation. If you don't know about that, I've learned a lot about vocation. I used to be at a Methodist institution, and they were into other things, so I'm learning each denomination has a very clear focus that has to be in every review of the curriculum done every few years. So Lutherans are very into vocation, but it was kind of this really important moment for me at a very formative stage in life to say, you know what, I want my Muslim faith to be dedicated to peace building, and there were resources for that. And then it led me at that age to apply for colleges, and I really wanted to go to a Quaker school because I was like, who's figured out, and Quaker scholars would contest this, who's figured out, how to do peace and justice and an approach to theology that includes consensus. And what was fascinating is when I went into the undergraduate program was many of those concepts existed in my own tradition, like shura, which is consensus, which is the process of building or making decisions in community through the example of Prophet Muhammad, who would engage multiple stakeholders in conversation. So anyways, that was my journey. It kind of created, this promise of God led me to a Quaker college and led me to the work that I continue to do in a deeper kind of engagement in my own tradition.
Thank you for sharing that kind of origin story of really seeking peace first for your own family and then from another tradition and then finding it in your own tradition. Some of the students who are present with us here tonight are going to be continuing to learn from you all day tomorrow in this class on restorative justice. But for those of us who don't have that honor of being with you tomorrow, would love to have you talk to us a little bit about, for you, what are the most important principles of restorative justice, and also what's been for you the hardest one to live into?
Well, I love compound questions. I think for me, restorative justice, particularly the part of it, a lot of people focus on the justice part of it. And I think what's been really helpful is not only looking at the juxtaposition of what we call retributive justice, which is seeking remedy to whatever harm one has that is meant to be equivalent to that harm, and a very rights-based approach to justice as well, and often tied to legislative approaches to justice. For me, what has been really powerful is to understand that one can still think of systems that are transactional as needing a component of transformation. And that's been helpful for me because my background is actually, I have a law degree, and when I was studying law, it was really helpful to think about, well, change happens through transactions, whether it's the transactions that we think about in the human context of whether it's contracts, whether it's transactions through litigation or whatever it might be, thinking in a deeper way. And this brought me really to the spiritual practices and thinking about, so often we can have an overly legalistic textual approach to whatever an issue might be. So it's not just the spirit of the law or the spirit of the letter that or the context or text that we're reading, but going even deeper and thinking about what and how do we engage in a way that we can still create and organize systems, but think about the transformation that happens. And that's where the concept of kind of taking us from restorative justice to healing justice has been really important, because when I've suffered or engaged or have experienced a harm, maybe my first response is obviously that I want a remedy for that. And then thinking about particularly looking at conflicts which have generations of violence attached to them, what does it mean to think about not just the next response to the harm that has been experienced? What does it mean to say, wait, we have to all pull back, there's something greater that's happening here, and what does it take to get to the point where restoration isn't just the cessation of violence, but it's creating what Elise Boulding, actually a Quaker scholar, talks about as cultures of peace. And what I realized is the incredible investment that is made in creating cultures of violence. And whether it's the transaction of war as an example of violence, but there are many other forms of violence, structural violence, using Galtung's approach. There's every year, and I'll just kind of end with this story, every year there's a Catholic Mass in Los Angeles for all the people that have died in the streets of Los Angeles. And these are not people who, and many of them, part of the Masses, some of them are unnamed and unclaimed. The idea is that as I look at that ritual, naming it is really important. Naming and giving names and sharing those names of people are really important, because there are cases where people were shot, there are cases where people were, run over by cars, but these are people who died in the streets of Los Angeles because of structural violence, because there weren't structures that supported they're living in our city, which has such, has such high housing prices, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a form of violence, and that's a transaction and a creation of conditions in which human beings have lost their lives. So to me, part of my engagement in restorative justice isn't just about the relational piece where two people get along. It's about looking at those structures, but not just in a transactional way, but in the human cost, and rituals that acknowledge and name that loss are the place to begin, because I often tell people, or I'll tell my students, sometimes the job of the scholar is to name the wound, because we can't heal if we haven't named the wound.
I'm really struck by the bullying term, culture of peace, and can you describe that some more? Like, what does it look like? Help us to imagine.
I think, I often talk about this idea that peace, the valency of that term, is not always positive for everyone. Linda Tuhuwai-Smith, who's a Maori scholar and an indigenous scholar, for instance, talks about like the terminology of peace for some indigenous communities is deeply, profoundly traumatic, because come sign a peace treaty where you transact half of your land away. So I think thinking about even the term peace, when I use that term, it's not everyone doesn't come into the room thinking that that's something that's enjoyable, and it's seen as a positive term. And I mention that because I think it's important to recognize that peace itself as a term and how it's been utilized. Sometimes it's been utilized for structures that perpetrate violence or actions that perpetrate violence. And I think that's really a part of this conversation is language and how we experience different, not just experience terms, but the histories behind those conversations. There have been similar kind of books and studies around the imposition of civility. Suddenly when there's discourse that happens and it becomes uncivil, then it's time to shut down that discourse because people are bringing up or engaging in conversation. So there's a lot of literature on the politics of discourse and when do we invoke civility and for whom and when is it used. And I think around cultures of peace, what Elise Boulding and many other scholars have helped us think through, and my students are reading Fania Davis's work, my students of the next, I can call my students for the next 24 hours. I think one of the things that's been really important is neither Elise Boulding or Fania Davis are theologians. Elise was a Quaker scholar and identified and did a lot of work from the Quaker tradition. But one of the realizations that I had was the cultural production of peace needs to include conversations about, I think we've reached the point where we talk about spiritual actors or leaders, like what are the role of spiritual leaders in peace building and peacemaking. But I think moving it to the next step to say, what are the resources that we can engage in, rituals and practices that already exist that don't just engage in us thinking about the cessation of violence, but moving to a place where the norm is I talk about not just thinking about war as a necessary evil, but war as an unnecessary evil. Because I think violence is an option that is less creative. Violence is an option that is also, it creates and is based on a binary understanding of, we're talking a lot in the class today about who is human, and to degrade and to engage in dehumanization, that's the first step if we look at kind of with any situation or any conflict, when you're able to begin to impose violence on other people, those are the steps that you go through as a dehumanization, and then the portrayal of people as non-humans. You can go through many case studies through our history. So I say all of that because I think one of the things we don't often talk about is the resourcing of violence and the under-resourcing of cultures of peace. And many of us are trying to do peace-building work on very limited budgets, and then you think about the budgets that are a part of any municipality or government or larger structure. how much we spend on entities that have violence as their main function. And I think we're only beginning to understand that we have to resource peace and cultures of peace. And I want to be very clear that when I say cultures of peace, it doesn't mean cultures of unanimity and lack of dissent. So I think we have to be very careful about not reifying that notion. But in particular, and I'll leave it there, I think one of the also, to look at it from, you read my very long bio, one of the problems that we face is peace is very often transacted again and not engaged in transformational processes. So we see, in my case, in conflicts around the world, the number one folks that come to the table and cross lines, and this is from working in intervention and gang violence in Los Angeles to working internationally, has been mothers who have lost their children. They don't see sides very often, or they're the ones that'll put down, you know, the cry for violence and war because they're ready to negotiate. And this is what I mean is like in many conflicts. But then who makes the decisions about the peace process? We know that women are very much not at the table. And in fact, Elise Boulding says it's women and children that often create cultures of peace, but then we're not able to engage in the agency and make decisions about the futures of the entities that are created out of formal peace processes. And that could be at the municipal level to the international level, that women and children are often not represented at the table, but are often the ones most affected, and the ones that are willing and able to engage and do the practical work of peace building. But then we're left out of the transactional piece. So to say all of that, just because you sign a paper saying there's a peace accord doesn't mean, and this has been the critique of many peace accords, is the leaders of those entities will come together and agree to a cessation of violence, but they haven't done the cultural work to bring communities to the point, or they haven't engaged very many of the peace builders that are in those communities to be a part of the process. And this, again, whether this is around violence in our cities or violence in internationally. And I often tell people I think there's peace builders in American cities that are Nobel laureates or should be Nobel laureates. It's fascinating to me that we don't honor peace builders. I'm sure here in New Haven, there are grandmothers whose houses are safe for people from all communities. For people who are familiar and kind of working in different scenarios, are they getting grants? Are they getting awards? Are they getting recognition? And very often we're not able to recognize peace builders amongst our own communities.
It feels so easy to imagine all these investments in cultures of violence. I think it's also important for us to be able to imagine and envision the stories of moments when we do invest in peace and instead of retributive methods. And so I'm wondering if you could tell us something from your experience in which you saw restorative justice do something in the world that felt perhaps unimaginable.
Sure. I mean, I think there's just at the very basic kind of level of how we study history. And whether it's the religious history of my tradition, we study and teach history as if it was all solved or victories were all done through warfare. I mean, think of American history class that you took. I can probably name most of the wars.
Yeah, right.
But I don't think about or don't engage or learn about the times when people where it wasn't just peace, but justice was achieved through other means. Yeah. And I think that's important because what it means is very often there is this, I don't have quite a theoretical framing of it at the moment, but I've been really thinking about this a lot, is that there is this belief, I think, about the inevitability of violence. And I think it becomes attached to certain communities as well. That you will hear right now, unfortunately, the rhetoric in popular media that the Middle East is ungovernable. And so somehow there are some communities and people who there is this like there needs to be an aggressive approach because these people, I don't know, whatever, you can fill in the blank of these people. It doesn't have to, and you can think of many, those of us who've had this experience, somehow this group of people deserves a certain kind of violent intervention or a form of governance that is violent because they're ungovernable, they're unmanageable. And I think that comes from, in many ways, not just stereotypes or clearly, probably forms of racism and ethnocentrism, but it also comes from the way that we think of human history and the elevation of victory through violence as a celebration or inevitable way of resolving conflict. So I put all of that out there because I think it also comes down, if we want to talk about religion, this idea that there's an inevitability of different religions that will be in perpetual war with each other. And I can't tell you how often that is justified. And then we go back and almost create a theology saying these, war is necessary, or these religious communities will never get along, or we hear they've never gotten along, which is also untrue. But any historical excavation to the contrary is not discussed or engaged, and not in a Pollyannish, like, oh, we got along and everything was great, but at least there wasn't always violence. So I think the inevitability, whether it's attaching one community to only being violent, or the only way to work with them, or the only way to govern is through violence, or that these two or three or groups or communities will always be engaged, I think those are false narratives that are attached to false histories that create futures in which some lives are more dispensable than others.
I'd love to keep talking a little bit about religion.
We are in a school
we're
of
in a divinity school, and I think, and you've taught at a number of theological schools, and I think a lot of us come here and we deconstruct our religious traditions, and we really interrogate how our religious traditions have participated in violent systems, and I think, at least I'm here because I also believe that our religious traditions and our spiritual communities have a lot to contribute to a more loving and just world. And I wonder if you could, I know you've done a lot of work on this, I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about how you see our spiritual
absolutely. And I think
contributing.
that part of the study, whether it's a study of religion or theological exploration and engagement and imagination in divinity and theological schools in the US, I think there's often sometimes we attach a kind of it's almost an anthropological primitivism to certain traditions or communities. And I'm not going to point out which, because I think the context really depends, what in this institution could be different from another. But this idea that not every community or religious community has a level of sophistication that is as evolved as another. And I just put that out there because I think it is a reality, and it actually finds its way into our interfaith and multi-religious spaces. So I'll give you an example where I've been on panels where I'm the only one that gets a question about religion and violence because I'm an embodied Muslim. Or the only examples of violence that are discussed are ones that happen to be in a somewhat Muslim majority context. So I had a colleague of mine from another faith tradition who's a scholar of peace and violence, and they said something that I thought was so fascinating. They were saying, oh, you have a public relations problem with Islam that is always attached to violence. And he said, I have a public relations problem with my tradition because it's always attached to peace. And I'm not able to be critical. And actually, you said, you would think it would be a positive public relations problem. And he said, actually, from a scholarly perspective, it's not just public relations, but it's bled into the scholarship of our work, where there are real, in his case, there were real communities dealing with the perpetuation and weaponization of religion. As any religious community, I always tell people, any community, you can weaponize religion for violence and you can instrumentalize religion for peace, and that's possible in any situation. But he was saying it's very hard for him to do self-critical conversations in his community because people have bought into it's always peaceful, and that's not true. And what's fascinating to me is kind of this internalized Islamophobia that I've recognized with some of the younger Muslim community members that I work with. And I'll say, and I was wondering, where does this come from? And they would say, the only time that I'll pick up the Quran is when my teacher in 5th grade is saying, well, why is your religion so violent? And it's so fascinating to me that the relationship with the text then becomes a defensive posture. And what does it mean to, as I often tell people, I'm a peace builder because I'm Muslim, not despite being Muslim. So what does it mean to go back to one's text and just, if you start with the assumption that it's going to be violent, what does that do to how you read it? Versus if you just go to it maybe with an assumption of not one outcome. But that made me really sad for some of the kids that I'm talking to, that this is kind of a burden that they're carrying, first at a young age, but then they're carrying that relationship back to their own text. And what does that mean when you're hearing these messages again and again? And the defensive posture to bring up religion, what does that do to your relationship with your own spirituality and religion? So anyways, I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but I think there are real world implications to that inevitability thesis of whether it's inevitability of a people or a community or a religious system as inevitably being violent, or relationships will never be resolved, they can't be resolved, then it leads us to essentialize and not see the resources that are there and practices. And I think one of the most important parts of peace building and building cultures of peace are creating rituals of peace. But one doesn't have to go that far. I think about, I was talking to someone, I'm also South Asian, and I was talking to some of my students yesterday that I think other people will resonate with this, is that my parents wouldn't often say, I love you, they would say, did you eat? Like, that's the first question, did you eat, right? And, and then when I call my mother, I will call her and she'll say, what did you have for dinner? And I'm like, why is she asking me? Oh, she's saying, I love you, because she wants to make sure that I'm fed. And then the funny thing is I do the same thing. If someone walks in the door, I'm like, what did you eat? Did you eat? That's the first question. And so sometimes it's religion, but it's also our cultures create hospitality or have rituals of hospitality. And I think when we unfortunately taint our lenses of analysis in a way that produces an outcome, and we don't have that critical approach that's open to the possibilities of what we can find, then it flattens cultural diversity within religious traditions. It flattens the capacity to see, Muhammad Abu Namir talks about, for instance, within some of the Arab Bedouin cultures, the peace building came through the fact that many were merchants and did business. And so there's cultures of peace that are built in. If anyone's done negotiation in a bazaar, you know that there's a process of going back and forth, and that's a ritual of peace building. So I think being able to pull ourselves back and be open to the possibility of visions of cultures of peace gives us so many resources. Religion is one of those potential resources for building cultures of peace, but there are also many others. And I would just encourage all of us to build that curiosity and that thirst for knowledge.
Have you seen in a restorative justice process where religion or spiritual community has been able to help?
Absolutely, yeah. I think, I often tell people, I don't think forgiveness is the goal of restorative justice, but it can be an outcome. And I say that because, there's been a lot of discourse around when there is an injury that happens, who's asked to forgive right away. And not everyone has equal access to getting the time to grieve. And we think public grieving is a whole part of this discourse and conversation, and who's allowed to grieve, who gets space to grieve, whose lives matter that we're able to grieve. And so having said all that, I think one of the things that's really powerful about restorative justice processes that engage both cultures of peace and spiritual resources is that, I've heard people say, well, you know what? I couldn't have forgiven as a human, but because for those who have religious belief systems connected to a divine presence, not everyone does, not every religion is based on a God-based approach. For some, they're able to say, well, you know what? I was able to forgive because I had a divine capacity. The divine capacity to forgive was one that I was able to access. But if I had to do it just as a human being, I wouldn't have been able to. So just as an example, I think another really important avenue that we're moving forward with is the agency of the earth as part of a restorative process. So I just often will give examples like in the Quran, there's Surah Zilzal that says, on the day of judgment, the earth will be asked to testify. So the earth in the Quran is described in the Arabic gendered term as a feminine. And so the earth is going to testify. So scholars have different explanations. They'll say it's about, what has happened. And I often think about, well, she's probably going to talk about the borders that we've put on her that have separated human beings, that have been causes for violence. Obviously, also many of the horrible climactic conditions. But I mention that because if we animate the earth in some way from its spiritual accountability that we have to it as human beings, that opens up so many avenues for thinking about restorative justice, not just for human-based creatures, but for many other forms of living ecosystems. And it opens up an ecosystemic approach to restorative justice, which I think is powerful in protecting the environment, but also creating this reality that, guess what? As much as I hate you today, and you hated me yesterday, and we may hate each other tomorrow when we both wake up, we're stuck on the same earth. And that space, the collective space of the earth over the borders that we've created on her, I have a hope that if we're able to have that conversation, that may bring to many of us the reality that we have to find a way to live together, especially as the earth gets more and more populated and the regions to which we can run and go away decrease in terms of our collective future, to think about interdependence over independence as the only option for human beings.
It is definitely becoming more and more evident that we're all connected, and as you say, there's not a lot of places to run from each other, and that will probably be more and more true as climate changes. One of the things we're doing here at YDS as we start thinking about bringing more restorative practices and restorative justice principles into our community is thinking about starting with circle process. It feels like that circles are a kind of a starting point, and that you may disagree with this, but I'm wondering how can circles change the world? We've got circle process, and we've got these big questions, huge issues of conflict in the world. Everybody has Israel-Palestine on our minds. We've got racism and white supremacy that we're really grappling with, and we're thinking about starting with circle processes. So, do the dots connect, or tell us?
I feel like who is that Nostradamus that's supposed to tell the future of the world? That's not a big. So my answer will be, and we'll talk about this in the class tomorrow, is kind of layers of conflict. So the interpersonal is one, where it's between a couple of people, two people, and then I often will talk about the community level, and then the structural level, kind of three circles. The professor in me wants to draw it out for you. So I think it's really powerful to engage in interpersonal peace building and peacemaking. It's important to do it at the community level. I think we have to, and I talked about this in class today, there's restorative justice principles and restorative justice processes, and we have to make sure that those processes continue to be in line with the principles. And those principles of restorative justice, there are many, we can think about Zair's work and many of the early thinkers, and some predate, obviously. There are Mennonite scholars, there are many peace builders and peacemakers that were South Asian, that were a part of our history in South Asia. And I just wanted to point out that I think we have to be really careful that sometimes the processes are derailed or dislocated from the principles. And so people will get attached to a particular process, like let's use the circle process, let's use that thing, let's use this thing, and it's like, wait, let's slow down. Are we actually, is the process serving everyone here? Is it culturally competent? Maybe it's not culturally competent for the group at the table, and you're using a process that is in a language that people don't understand. You know what I mean? I'm just pointing out, like, I think it's important that whatever process you engage, whether it's circles, triangles, whatever the process is, I don't know why I started thinking about shapes, but whatever the process is, thinking about, like, is it still grounded in principles of the whole community having a voice, who's not at the table? Do I need to have multiple processes? Do I need to adapt the process? Who are my facilitators of the process? Are the facilitators perpetuating harm? I mean, it's just, those are all the questions where the principles have to be consistently and constantly revisited. And I think that's my worry, as I mentioned too, why Smith's work about peace accords or peace negotiations being damaging. The very same can happen with restorative justice processes, where if they're not grounded in principles, they can be utilized to actually perpetuate injustice. And there are some scholars that are writing about that as well, especially in like organizational structures. It's like, well, we have a circle. It's like, well, that's wonderful, but there's people that are, you know, dealing with injustices still. And I think we want to be very careful about that. And just one other thing, you were talking about spirituality and religion, and I mentioned too Y. Smith, and something I talked about in the class today is that many processes come from indigenous spiritual practices and are not named, and are not, whether it's indigenous Hawaiian processes of reconciliation, or Ubuntu from different cultures in the African continent. You know, there's many that I could name. I mentioned Sulh, which is from the, Muhammad Ibn Nimr talks about it from the Arab context. All of these processes had an origin, so when we say circles, I just want to mention that that's actually a spiritual practice, right? It is a practice that has an origin. I don't know what particular kind of circle you're engaging in. You know, people are like, oh, well, we have a talking stick. And I'm like, well, you know, that was a spiritual practice of a particular community at a time. And so I think it's really important to also recognize that restorative justice processes are derived from practices that have an origin. And some of them are very particular origins. And so sometimes that dislocation from the origin, I also wonder, so whether putting aside the idea of the restorative justice principles or including them as well, is thinking about the origins of these processes. And as those of us that are interested in religion and spirituality, is trying to understand and acknowledge, at the very least, acknowledge those processes are not neutral. They didn't come from just, you know, a transactional approach. And that's my worry, is when we don't understand that history, or it's not shared, or it's not engaged, then you know, besides concerns around cultural appropriation, is just understanding that those are also spiritual practices. They're not just kind of a process that's out there that's created that's, again, transactional. So I just wanted to mention it's a question of scholarly integrity. Just if you're going to introduce something, it's helpful to at least acknowledge the origin of it.
Yeah.
If not more, hopefully more, but yeah.
I'm being signaled that it's time to move to our gathered communities questions. So,
and I think I was just going to say I can probably take like 3 questions, considering. And I'd love for, if you feel comfortable introducing yourself, that'd be lovely.
Hi, I'm Trevor.
Hi, Trevor.
I'm a third-year MDiv here. I currently work in mass atrocities for the U.S. Department of State, and in the context that we're working in, there's a lot of violence that's towards a particular like militia or a totalitarian regime that has a lot of power, and there's mass atrocities perpetuated on people who are powerless, who have no ability to defend themselves. So I guess my question to you would be, how do you begin to incentivize a totalitarian regime or militia that has all the power to begin undertaking restorative justice? And then secondly, what's the role of the international community in that? Because in my experience, it's sometimes made it far worse, and it's been used to prop up regimes, but also that may be the only incentive to push them forward.
Yeah, and I think because we're talking about this is where I would say like we'd have to dig down into case studies and like this is like a very broad context. I would say a couple of things that are really important is I think it's really helpful to be really aware of the deep history of that particular scenario and context, because I think a lot of times I was mentioning to my students today that I've gotten off on an airplane and I've talked, meaning like I've traveled somewhere else and talked to people that are engaged in a particular conflict scenario. And a war 500 years ago is something they're carrying with them in that moment. So part of it is, I think, for those of us that have a facilitator or intervener role, is to understand, not from my perspective, but to understand from the perspective of the actors on the ground. And it doesn't mean I have to accept it as inevitable, but to understand the urgency or immediacy and how people are forming their identities. And particularly, I think, for conflicts and situations that have been perpetuated over time, sometimes it's clear to identify who is, and I'm sure you've experienced this, is like even mapping or diagnosing conflicts. And I often talk about so important in our diagnosis, like what is happening right now. But when there has been a conflict that has gone on for a number of years, it's not always clear who is in the wrong and who's in the right, to use very moral, judgmental terms. And for the actors on the ground, I've worked, whether it's, and I always want to mention, I don't want to say it's like just foreign conflicts as an American, but also this plays out in our neighborhoods in the US as well. Because I think it's very important to equalize human beings as actors in whatever ways they have available to them. So I think there's also this reality that there becomes an identity formation in many conflicts. I call it in my work oppositional identities. That has a different meaning in other scholarly work, but one becomes so attached to being not what the other person is. And it's been fascinating to me in so many scenarios where when I ask people, who are you? The answer is the opposite of whatever, and so I think, and sometimes, and that's a trauma response too. And so I think what you're talking about is a reality. So in many situations, so I think what I've tried to do is try to understand from the different parties on the ground, what and how are they experiencing the reality of what's in front of them, even if I see it as distorted, right? And it doesn't mean, again, I have to accept that, but to see it from that perspective, because then the intervention is much more effective when it takes into account someone's identity in this moment is inclusive of a war from 500 years ago. It doesn't mean necessarily that the intervention has to accept that as moving forward, but to be understanding of that. And I think, and with some of the mediators that I've worked with, when they, again, get off the airplane, kind of dismissing that reality from the get-go can delegitimize their presence in that particular situation. So I would just say that's one important factor, is to understand. I often tell my students and others that I work with in many conflicts is the people closest to the conflict are actually the experts, right? They both know how to perpetuate it, but they know the way through it. And so part of what we can do as facilitators, whether it's in the diplomatic corps or whether it's in humanitarian workers who are really important, chaplains in the military have become peace builders in many situations across the world as well. So I just mentioned there's so many different ways in these scenarios we show up that you can actually surprisingly play the role of a peace builder, is to understand how people are experiencing it in that moment and to learn more. And I think to understand that there are many different incentives to peace building, and some of them are not noble, and some of them are not lofty, and the cessation of violence is the most important. The reduction of harm in that moment, right, is so important, because you can't really do the work if people, I think about interfaith work. I was working with some colleagues who had just come out of a conflict zone, and they were all faith leaders, and then we invited a speaker to come to the class, and he was like, he was doing work in his community in the US, and he's like, we just get together and we have a potluck at the mosque and then one at the church, And this faith leader was like, if I show up with a Muslim colleague, I probably will get shot. And he's like, I'm not sure if the potluck idea will work. So I think even the model of intervention and the assumptions of the costs that people bring to the table and incentivizing, and a lot of the work may have to be done, as you know, in private. It's not public yet. But I don't think it's, to me, ultimately, and this is something that I was thinking about as we were in our class, and I'll end here because there's so many other things we could talk about, but one of the questions we have in class right now is reconciliation justice? And to me, and that's based on Dan Philpott's work, to me, it's not as much about is the quality of the relationship where everyone is going to get together. There's been some research that says actually when people have weak ties with one another, that's a way through conflict. You don't have to have the deepest care and concern to get through. Is to understand that part of the ways that we think about cessation of violence is incentivizing the cause of whatever is the greatest harm, to think about that in a way that gives it priority. And because it's very hard to do peace building when there's mass slaughter, right? And that means that the pragmatic approach tied with a theological and spiritual approach is very important. That's why I started off class with 5 different case studies of where I've intervened, because I think what can happen is you can be wholly pragmatic and forget the spiritual element, because people get through a conflict. This is what I was brought into a particular, I won't say which international actor in terms of a think tank, but I was brought into a think tank where they didn't think religion was important at all in peace building. And I was literally brought in that day to say, guess what? They were saying, we don't understand this is a particular conflict where people who have been victims of violence, of religious violence, are still calling on God. And they were like, we don't understand the importance of, I was like, well, it's because religion harms and it also heals. So I'm saying all of this because I think that what you're bringing up is it's also really important to do the analysis around people's spiritual beliefs, talk to religious actors, but to present options that are deeply pragmatic and to think pragmatically and strategically. Because I've seen some wonderful peace proposals that are completely impractical and they're not going to go forward. And that's where I think it's, and clearly I could say a lot about this. That's where I think the people that are negotiating peace, the people that are peacemakers, the people that are in other many tracks of diplomacy, we just have to be in conversation with each other and recognize each other's roles and have a more cooperative approach between development, peace builders, those that negotiate the peace, and those that are on the military side too, like having much more open channels of communication. And I know that's very difficult, and there are many compromises that are difficult to make in those conversations. But I often feel like that pragmatic, strategic approach is what we're missing when, those of us that are religious leaders want to go in and say, it's just you have to interpret this verse of the Quran or the Bible differently. It's like, well, pragmatically, how does it play out? So thank you for your question. I could clearly keep going on and on, so I will pass it on to someone else. Maybe one more question, yeah.
Hi, I'm Eli Reimer. I worked briefly at the Center for Community Justice in Elkhart, Indiana. And I'm curious what you think.
Shout out to Indiana, sorry.
I'm Mennonite, so.
Oh, yes.
Big restorative justice fan. But I'm curious, it seems like restorative justice is at a point where it's being increasingly institutionalized.
Yes.
Most of the work I did was with the police department and through the legal system. And I'm curious what you think about that shift. I mean, clearly you don't. No,
I think it's really, I think what you raise is, and this is the constant, if you talk to anyone that does what we call relational problem solving or process consulting or whatever it is in terms of human contact theory, that the amelioration of the human condition is based on deprovincialization, meaning that we have contact with each other, the contact, and it's not just the kind of contact, but the quality of the contact, the depth of the contact. It's always our challenge to have, and this kind of relates to the former question, is how do you scale that up So that interpersonal level of peace building, how do you scale that up so structures change? And then what do you do if you change the structure? I'll just give you an example in doing what is now the terminology shift of doing victim offender mediation, where it's wonderful that a particular court or justice system in a jurisdictional approach maybe will adopt victim offender mediation, meaning where you can do a conflict process instead of adjudication through a legal system alone. And so I've walked into situations like that and I'm given a script and I have to say the exact same thing as a facilitator, and I'm like, wait, I'm in this conflict situation where this, and I just know intuitively, having done hundreds and hundreds of these kinds of mediations, that like I have somewhat of a structure, but I, am responsive. And I have a colleague, this is fascinating, who teaches on the West Coast. When they do conflict mediation processes and they work in a Christian context, they have someone pray, and this is fascinating, in another room, and this person swears that when the person is praying in the other room for that conflict, that there's like a release, and they can like figure cosmologically they are connected. And I have another friend that fasts before they do mediation of a different spiritual practice, because part of their discipline and peace building is a very embodied practice. So I raise that all with you because there's so many different ways to do the work. But I'm not really giving you a resolution, because I think it's, this is also, and I'm going to talk about this a little tomorrow, the tension between abolition and reform. And that's a constant conversation that I think is playing out in the discourse, but it's playing out in that very pragmatic reality of elimination of a justice system, and others who are talking about reform. And having spent a year doing policy work in an actual governing system, it's understandable that people want to and have problems with the undergirding of a justice system, and it's also the reality that it continues. And how do we think about practical approaches that also have a longer-term vision of a different form of justice than what exists now? So how do you hold that all together? And I'm not saying I have an answer for you. What I do think is important is to understand that when things are institutionalized, it becomes difficult when we're looking for flexibility and plasticity of processes. And that's where I think part of the answer is in how you train the people that are doing those processes, because it's possible to set up some groundwork. Let's say if I'm working with a group of mediators, and I've actually developed one of my first scholarly articles was on police community processes. And one of the things that I thought was really important in that work was, for instance, we had, I thought it was really important to have civil rights monitors over restorative justice processes, so that's part of continuing to re-engage, looking at the process, but making sure that it's congruent with restorative justice principles. But another piece was do mediation, but also have public dialogues of accountability. So sometimes and then it was also, how do you train the people that are doing both the dialogue and mediation work, and are they sharing information with each other, so that if there's a concern in the community, that that information funnels its way into the agendas for public dialogues, and vice versa. So I share that because I think it's always helpful to have also options for multiple forms of processes, to also have in restorative or peace and justice peace processes, to make sure that people have access to advocates. If you cut off any access to advocacy or accountability, then that can perpetuate, unfortunately, injustice in those processes. And third, I think, is to have the people that are doing it, but also to have multiple kind of skills that you assess for effectiveness. Not just did you follow the script that I gave you, but if you deviated from the script, why did you do that, and what was helpful about it? So all of that and how you do that. Obviously, what I'm saying takes a lot of resources. It's much easier to have a cookie cutter approach, and I understand why that's needed. And the question becomes, do we choose, if what's the option, so I'm using this as a moral kind of question, if the option is a restorative over, a more restorative, I won't say maybe, it's more restorative over retributive, does one take that and sit comfortably with that or not? And I think about, you can have all these conversations theoretically, and part of me is like, well, the biggest question is, for me, is always, is there a reduction of harm in the moment that's possible? And if there's 50 kids that are gonna stay out of the carceral system in that moment, I'm gonna say go for that option, right? I don't know, that's part of how I approach it, is like, it's not just my Najiba's moral compass, but is there also a real life implication to that policy decision that impacts real people? And I go talk to those people that are impacted and ask them what they wanna do, because those are the people that I'm accountable to, not just my own ego and moral perspective.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for opening up this conversation, and there's so much depth to what you've been bringing to us, and I know our students are going to really benefit from your teaching tomorrow. And we're going to let you rest now. I know it's been a long day.
I feel like it's one of those, where you'll ask an author like a question, they're like, read the book. I'm like, take the class, except you had to have already registered for it prior, but yes. Yes.
Well, thanks for giving us a little glimpse tonight.
Yes,
and,
absolutely.
Would you join me in thanking Dr. Syeed?